Welcome to the Wake Before the Day podcast with my parents, Clark and Bobby. We're excited to talk about the Bible and the Holy Spirit adventures. Thanks for listening.
Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to the Wake Before the Day podcast. I'm here with my beautiful wife, Bobby, and we're excited to dive into Exodus.
Nice.
Chapter 16 today, and if you can just remember where we've been up to this point, Moses had been called and risen up within the palace of Egypt. He took matters into his own hands. He made a huge mess of things by killing an Egyptian. God's people rejected him. He fled to the wilderness of Midian for 40 years,
Right.
only for God to speak to him through the burning bush and calling him back. And after the plagues and after the Red Sea and the Passover, they find themselves now delivered, freed, out in the wilderness, following God, and complaining.
They're hungry.
They're hungry.
I know. Even that, just these first 15 chapters is such an epic story. I mean, the first 2 chapters is such an epic story. So just to know that, like, this is only the beginning with the Israelites. Like, they've gone through what, has been a miraculous journey. And now there's almost like a different picture on display where instead of these huge moves of God, which there are still going to be moves of God, it's almost just a really boring, mundane trusting that they're being called into.
Yeah.
And so with that, as you read this chapter, come just a lot of back and forth between the Israelites and Moses, God and Moses, Moses and God, God and the Israelites.
Yes.
And so it's just kind of like, okay, so we'll flesh out this chapter as we jump in. I'll read verse 16. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out of this desert to starve, this entire assembly to death. And so right away, this chapter kicks off understanding like, okay, we're in a new land, we're in a new month. And so that's still like that timeline is actually calling back to Passover when we had the different timeline set. But we're still dealing with a hard heart. And this time it's not Pharaoh.
This is a much more simple illustration, but I do sense my kids' voices. I can hear my kids' voices in the car. Are we there yet? She's touching me. He's hitting me. I know we're going to Disneyland, but let's just go home. This is taking forever.
So true.
We're going almost up to Big Bear Lake, Dad, but let's just go home. These roads are too windy. And like there's a complete forgetfulness of the journey and the destination as to where we're going, but also what we just left.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to start off with a brief recap of saying, like, hey, look at what God's done. And they're here grumbling in verse 3.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he brought us out here to die. And you presented a really interesting question just right before the camera turned on.
Yeah.
How would you distinguish honesty from grumbling?
Well, I think historically that's something that like the Christian community and the church is just kind of like, oh, they're bad. Like you should not complain. You should not grumble. You should not do this. And you read that and you see, okay, yes, we need to remember the faithfulness of God. We need to really lean on Him, not on our own understanding. And now we also, and Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he says too, like reiterates this, don't complain. And we hold this together with the Psalms, with Lamentations, with honesty, these books where there really is calling out. And even at the beginning of this chapter where God responds to the cries of the Israelites. So I would propose this, and maybe this is helpful, maybe this isn't. So a type of grumbling, so we'll use a car analogy, that is going on here. So we know that it's grumbling against the Lord. That's verse 8. We're going to get there. But that type of grumbling, if it were coming from the backseat of our car, would sound like, Dad, you don't even know what you're doing. Dad, why are you driving us this way? This is the wrong way. You're going too slow. Dad, who are you to even think that this is the right way? You don't know. So I think that's this kind of grumbling.
Yeah.
When
questioning my navigational abilities.
Well, I'm questioning your integrity as a father in my grumbling. I am. And I'm questioning your goodness as a father. When it comes to honesty and just bringing complaints and laments to the Lord, those come from a place of genuine need and genuine concern and genuine despair. There's not the same questioning. It's literally just an all out, like the Israelites at the beginning of the book of Exodus, where they're saying, we can't do it. We need Yahweh. So we need someone else.
If we had to translate that into like the voice of a child in a car, it'd be something along the lines of like, hey, Daddy, I've never been here before.
Where are we going?
Where are we going? And
Yeah.
I've never seen the mountains like this before. How far away is the destination? Or
Yes. Is
like
there
that.
going to be a bathroom there? I
Yeah.
really need to go. Do you think there?
Yeah.
So there's a stark difference. And you see this actually again in multiple places throughout the Bible. But one of the ones that's coming to my mind right now is even the story of Jesus' birth, when you have two different responses to how this is going to happen. So you have the response of the Virgin Mary, and then you have the response of Zechariah with the birth of John the Baptist.
Yeah.
And those are two distinct different responses of the Lord. So Zechariah, he's mute after that. And because the question sounds exactly the same, but we understand that in that is the heart posture of these people is, Lord, how can this be?
Yeah.
And one of them is one of genuine, sincere reverence and questioning, and one of them is doubt. And a question of Yahweh.
Yeah.
And so important to distinguish between what's going on with the Israelites here in the wandering and how actually the heart of God is that we, in relationship to him, that we come honestly.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love that.
It's good.
It's a good word.
Keep going.
See, as we keep going, then what happens, though, is like time and time again, God provides. God provides them. If you read verses 6 through 12, God promises to provide them food each day, 2 times a day. You see that in verse 6 and 8 and 12. And if you can envision in your mind's eye what this looks like again, this is probably between 2 and 3 million people.
Big. Yeah.
An excess of people just like cruising through the desert.
Yep.
And God is providing food for all of them.
Everything,
and it says that they're like
direction,
wafers that have salted but also may taste like honey. Can't be that bad. I mean, if you have to have it for a long time, I get it, but like, whoa. So this is an invitation to begin to trust God as Jehovah Jireh.
Yeah.
Like God is our provider. God knows exactly what we need. In verses 16 through 36, specifically like in verse 22, he begins to unfold a beautiful teaching again that reiterates something that goes back to creation. Verse 22 says, on the 6th day, they shall end up with twice as much food as they need. And the reason why is that God is going to give his people a Sabbath rest on the 7th day. Unlike everything Pharaoh had ever done to them, unlike everything that was required of them in Egypt, any kind of slave driver or whatever system that was put in place, God says, I want you just to rest.
Right.
I want you to worship me. I want you to enjoy your family, enjoy food, enjoy my creation, and just rest. That is something that is so foreign to God's people.
Yes.
And here again, you have God's heart on full display. And here the other instruction is to put some of that manna, which will eventually go in the Ark of the Covenant, as a reminder that God truly sustains and provides for his people. God's grace, another important note to make too, that I got this from a commentary, I can't remember which author to cite. Notice that God's manna goes into the Ark of the Covenant before the law does.
Right.
And this is a very important distinction, especially for the Old Testament, in that God's grace precedes his commandments. God's grace precedes the law. It's God sustaining, initiating, completing, redeeming, saving before he says, and now here's what you must do. Because as we said a couple of podcasts ago, it was all about God initiating and doing everything. God did the plagues, he parted the Red Sea, and then it comes to that this, hey, if you're going to follow me, here's what this needs to look like.
Yeah.
It requires obedience, which is what we're going to flesh out more in this chapter.
Because what we get at in chapters 15, 16, and 17 is this is just months after the Exodus when they were just saved from Egypt. And now we're setting the stage for how we get Egypt out of our hearts. And so that's going to require faith. That's going to require belief. And how that looks totally different than just like you said. So there's a partnership. So God was on the scene and he just did everything. And he continues to do everything for the Israelites. And there's a call to partnership. And so while we understand how there's just a huge importance on telling and retelling these stories about God and his goodness and what he did and why that's such a huge part of their oral culture here, we also have to remember that past faith isn't enough to sustain them with where they're going. And so what new experiences is Yahweh laying out for them? Well, the first one is, are we going to walk in obedience with how he's asking us to rest and how he's asking us to order our lives around him bringing food? Because you see, that's hard enough. Like, okay, we have to pause there. Fail. We've got some people that are getting too much, and then we have maggots and they're saving it for the next day. And so just those that enough? Can you trust me? Because that's what rest is. Can we trust Yahweh enough that we don't actually have to, which would be so against their flesh.
Yeah.
And even their mind, like if they're really questioning the goodness of God, well, then they would want to be like straying off and doing their own thing. They would want to be gathering their own food, making their own food. So not only is there a visceral reaction of like, no, we have worked all of our lives under Pharaoh, we need to continue working, but then also just within their mind and their brain thinking like, no, this isn't the best way to take care of ourselves. We don't actually want to just sit and trust and wait for the next day. We need to be preparing and hoarding. And so there's so many things that I could take and sit in that for like today in our time and what that looks like. But that's what is going on with the Israelites now.
Yeah, and God's requiring them active obedience, saying, okay, celebrate and retell the story of God, and like Bobby's saying, be obedient today.
Yeah.
Do what you know to do today. God's laid out his word for us today. Worship him today. And as we do that, we can't just sit back and go, I remember the good old days. Back when. It's like God has more for us now. So if you look about how this is structured, really 15, 16, 17, there's grumbling, there's God providing, and then there's testing. Again, God's testing here is not like a pop quiz from school. It's not a test that he's like trying to flunk you or fail you. Earlier it talks about God's testing has a great purpose. He wants to see if they're going to obey. That's what it says in this chapter. In Exodus 20, verse 20, it says this, don't be afraid. God has tested you so that you will fear God, and you will keep you from sinning. So when you're out in the wilderness and God's word has been laid before you, he's called you and told you how to live your life, the obedience is, I trust God that his way really is best, and I'm going to do this because he's faithful, he's proven to be good, he's proven to be trustworthy. So I'm going to obey him rather than giving into temptation and going the way of the world, which is sin. So Exodus 20:20 says, God has tested you so that you will keep from sinning and continue to follow him and obey. Hebrews 3 picks up on this very story, and it adds a couple words, and I'm going to read it to you. In Hebrews 3, verses 9 and 10, it says, where your ancestors tested me and tried me, though for 40 years they saw what I did. That is why I was angry with that generation. And I said, their hearts are always going astray. They have not known my ways. So this is written in the book of Hebrews now in the New Testament, and it's applying it to the church, saying, now, through the lens of Jesus, read this story and learn the lesson. Because you and I are going to be going through a wilderness. Yes, we are.
Yeah.
But the Lord teaches us, Jesus teaches us that this place ain't our home, that we're pilgrims passing through. And if we truly are sojourners or pilgrims passing through, the only way we're going to find our way is being attached to Jesus, led by the Spirit, being obedient to him, living life through his story. And the last thing I would add too is the whole don't judge your circumstances by your stomach. Don't be driven by your gut here, like by the fleshly desires of your body. Because despite everything God had done for the people, Israel so quickly became self-centered. Well, it's all about us, and what are we going to eat? And I don't want this food. And the grumbling, like Bobby said so well, it went back against God's character. It wasn't just an honest question, which is invited in the Bible. It was more of, I don't think you're good. I think you brought us out here to die.
Yeah.
And that grumbling just goes back against everything God had already done to prove in him as the initiator, sustainer, redeemer up to this point in the story. So this is a lot.
It is a lot. I like how, so this chapter, as I sit with it, you really just get a clear picture of how we can meet and understand and know God in our perceived needs, and how there's trials and there's testings, but throughout all of it, there's an unchanging God. And so even though our circumstances are upside down or they're totally different yesterday from today, we still see how there's a faithful God like no one else, who is unchanging, who's always been, and who always will be.
Amen.
And so it's really good. Yeah.
Well, hey, thank you for joining us for the podcast. As we've already mentioned, this is Exodus 16. We hope that you will read this for yourself and share the word with somebody else. Encourage someone to join you in your reading. And we look forward to joining you tomorrow with Exodus 17. God bless you.
The Lord bless you and keep you. Don't make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give him his peace. Have a great day.